I stood at the entrance of the Grand Willow Estate, adjusting my tie for the third time in 5 minutes. The autumn air carried the scent of roses and champagne, and through the ornate glass doors, I could see my daughter Sarah in her flowing white dress, laughing with her bridesmaids. For a moment my heart swelled with pride. This was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life, watching my little girl marry the man she loved. But as I stepped through those doors, I had no idea I was walking into my own public execution. "Dad." Sarah's voice rang out across the marble foyer, but something in her tone made my stomach tighten. She wasn't rushing to hug me like I'd hoped. Instead, she was standing with her new mother-in-law, Patricia Whitmore, a woman whose jewelry probably cost more than most people's cars. "Patricia, this is my father," Sarah said, and I extended my hand with a genuine smile. Patricia's eyes swept over me from head to toe. My off-the-rack suit, my 10-year-old dress shoes that I'd polished until they gleamed, my simple watch. Her handshake was limp, dismissive. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with barely concealed disappointment. "How quaint." I felt the first sting, but I brushed it off. Wedding days were stressful. People said things they didn't mean. Then Sarah laughed, a sound that would haunt me for weeks to come. "Don't mind Dad, Patricia. Well, let's just say he's not exactly rolling in money like your family." She said it loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, her voice carrying that particular tone that cuts deeper than any knife. "I mean, look at this place. It probably costs more to rent this venue for one night than Dad makes in 6 months." The conversations around us stopped. I could feel eyes turning toward us, whispers starting like a brush fire. My face burned with embarrassment, but what hurt more was the look in Sarah's eyes. Not regret, not embarrassment for hurting me, but satisfaction. Like she was finally saying what she'd been thinking for years. "Sarah," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "this is your wedding day. Let's not what, Dad?" "Tell the truth." She turned to address the growing audience of wedding guests. "My father thinks because he helped pay for my college that he's somehow, I don't know, successful. But look around. Everyone here knows what real success looks like." Patricia smiled, that cold, calculated smile that rich people perfect over decades of looking down on others. "Sarah, darling, don't be too hard on him. Not everyone can be blessed with opportunities." The word opportunities hit me like a physical blow. If only they knew about the opportunities I'd created, the risks I'd taken, the empire I'd built from nothing. But I'd learned long ago to keep my wealth quiet, to live modestly, to let my actions speak instead of my bank account. He used to be a janitor. "You know," Sarah continued, her voice growing louder, more confident as she saw the shocked faces around her. "Worked nights cleaning office buildings while I was growing up. I remember being so embarrassed when my friends' parents would ask what my dad did for work." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every cruel word. I saw pity in some faces, disgust in others, and, worst of all, agreement in a few. These people, Sarah's new family, her husband's friends, they were judging me based on her words, writing me off as some pathetic man who'd somehow stumbled into this elegant world. But you know what the funny thing is? Sarah's voice had taken on a theatrical quality now, like she was performing for an audience. "He actually thinks he belongs here. He thinks because he scraped together enough money to help with the wedding that he's somehow, I don't know, important." My chest felt tight. Each word was like a weight pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was betrayal on a level I'd never imagined possible. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd read bedtime stories to, the teenager I'd stayed up worried sick about when she was out late, the young woman whose college tuition I'd paid without a single complaint. "Sarah, please," I whispered, but she was on a roll now, feeding off the energy of her audience. "The truth is, Dad, you're broke. You've always been broke, and standing here in this beautiful place pretending you fit in with people who actually matter, it's just sad." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the blood rushing to my face. Somewhere in the distance, a string quartet was playing Pachelbel's Canon, the same piece that had played at Sarah's mother's funeral 15 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, being buried alive by my own daughter's words. Patricia placed a manicured hand on Sarah's arm. "Come along, dear. We should check on the flowers before the ceremony begins." As they walked away, I heard Patricia's voice, not quite whispered enough. "Well, at least she's honest about where she comes from. That's something, I suppose." I stood there alone in that magnificent foyer, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and marble columns, feeling smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. Guests began to disperse, but I caught fragments of their conversations. "Can you believe she said that to her own father?" "Well, money can't buy class, can it?" "Poor man, how embarrassing." As I watched my daughter disappear into the crowd, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a white flag of surrender, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in months. William Chen, Grand Willow Estate Manager. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Morrison? What a surprise to hear from you on a Saturday." "Hello, William," I said, my voice steady now, controlled. "I need to see you. I'm at the estate right now." "Of course, sir. I'll be right there. Is everything all right with the Henderson Whitmore wedding?" I watched Sarah through the window, posing for photos with her new family, her face radiant with joy and cruelty in equal measure. "Everything," I said slowly, "is about to be perfect." As I waited for William in the estate's private office, memories flooded back like a dam had burst. I closed my eyes and I was 25 again, holding Sarah for the first time in that sterile hospital room, her mother weak but smiling beside us. "She's going to be extraordinary," Ellen had whispered, her voice hoarse from labor. I can already tell. Ellen was right, of course. Sarah had been extraordinary. Extraordinarily difficult. Even as a child, Sarah had shown signs of the entitlement that would eventually poison our relationship. When her mother died in that car accident, Sarah was only 8, I thought tragedy might bring us closer together. Instead, it seemed to create a wall between us that grew taller with each passing year. I remembered the night she turned 16. I'd worked double shifts for 3 months to buy her the car she wanted. Not the practical Honda I'd suggested, but the BMW convertible she'd seen her friend Ashley driving. When I presented her with the keys, wrapped in a silver bow, she looked at it like I'd given her a participation trophy. "It's not the right color," she'd said, not even bothering to hide her disappointment. "Ashley's is white. This one is silver." "Sarah," I'd said carefully, "this car cost more than I make in half a year. The color. If you can't afford to get me what I actually want, then maybe you shouldn't buy me anything at all." That night, I'd sat in my study until dawn, staring at my bank statements, wondering how I'd raised someone so different from the values I'd tried to instill. The truth was, I could have afforded 10 white BMWs. I could have bought her the entire dealership. But I'd been raised to believe that children should understand the value of money, should appreciate what they received. Clearly, I'd failed. College had been worse. Sarah attended Northwestern University, my alma mater, though she never knew it. I'd established an anonymous scholarship fund years earlier, one that conveniently covered her full tuition. To her, it was just another scholarship she'd earned through her academic merit. To me, it was another secret gift she'd never acknowledge. But even with her education paid for, she constantly needed more money. Sorority fees, spring break trips, designer clothes to fit in with her wealthy classmates. Each request came with the implicit threat that she'd drop out, ruin her life if I didn't comply. "Dad, everyone in my sorority is going to Cabo for spring break," she'd called to tell me during her junior year. "I'm the only one who can't afford it. Do you know how embarrassing that is?" I'd wired her the money the same day. $3,000 for a week-long party that I couldn't afford to attend myself, even though I could have bought the resort where they were staying. The pattern continued after graduation. Sarah got a job at a marketing firm in Chicago, but her salary wasn't enough to maintain the lifestyle she felt she deserved. So I supplemented it, sending monthly checks that she accepted without gratitude, as if they were her due. When she met Bradley Whitmore, everything changed. Bradley came from old money, the kind of wealth that whispered instead of shouting, that wore understated elegance like armor. His family owned pharmaceutical patents that generated passive income in the millions. To Sarah, he represented everything she'd always felt she deserved: status, security, and, most importantly, superiority over her humble origins. The first time she brought Bradley home, I could see the embarrassment in her eyes as she showed him our modest suburban house. It was a beautiful home. 4 bedrooms, a manicured lawn, a 3-car garage, but compared to the Whitmore estate, it might as well have been a shack. "Dad's done well for himself," she'd said to Bradley, her voice carrying an undertone I'd never heard before. "Considering where he started." That was the beginning of the revisionist history. Suddenly, every sacrifice I'd made became evidence of our family's limitations. The night shifts I'd worked as a young father weren't noble sacrifices. They were embarrassing reminders of our lower-class origins. The small apartment we'd lived in during her early childhood wasn't a temporary situation while I built my business. It was proof that we'd never really belonged among successful people. Sarah began creating distance between us, screening my calls, avoiding family gatherings, making excuses not to visit. When she did come by, she'd critique everything. The furniture was outdated. The neighborhood wasn't prestigious enough. My car was embarrassing to be seen in. "Dad," she'd said during her last visit before the engagement, "you really need to start thinking about your image. When I marry Bradley, his family is going to be judging us. Judging you. And what exactly would you like me to change?" I'd asked. "Everything," she'd replied without hesitation. The engagement party had been my first real taste of the Whitmore family's wealth and attitude. I'd been introduced to Bradley's parents as Sarah's father, never by name, as if my identity was solely defined by my relationship to their future daughter-in-law. Patricia. Whitmore had looked at me the same way someone might examine a stain on expensive fabric, with distaste and resignation that it would have to be dealt with. So, Bradley's father, Robert, had asked, "What line of work are you in?" I'd been tempted to tell him the truth then, to explain about Morrison Holdings, about the real estate empire I'd built, about the net worth that probably exceeded his own. Instead, I'd given my standard modest response: "I'm in property management." Technically true, but deliberately misleading. I manage properties the way generals manage armies. Now, sitting in the estate office where I'd made the final decision to purchase this very venue 3 years ago, I realized that all those years of modesty and humility had backfired spectacularly. I'd raised a daughter who was ashamed of me, who saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a foundation to build upon. The office door opened, and William Chen entered with his characteristic composed smile. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "I have to say, the wedding is going beautifully. The Henderson family seems very pleased with everything." I looked at him steadily. "William, I think it's time we had a conversation with the wedding party about the venue ownership." His eyes widened slightly. "Sir, is there a problem?" I thought about Sarah's words, about the laughter of the guests, about the way Patricia Whitmore had looked at me like I was something she'd stepped in. "No problem at all," I said. "I just think it's time for some transparency." William Chen had been managing the Grand Willow estate for me for 3 years, ever since I'd acquired the property in a bankruptcy auction. He was one of the few people who knew that the unassuming man in the off-the-rack suit was actually the owner of one of the most prestigious wedding venues in the state. "Sir," William said carefully, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I want to make sure I understand what you're asking. You want me to reveal your ownership to the wedding party?" I leaned back in my chair, looking out the window at the manicured gardens where my daughter was currently posing for photographs with her new husband's family. They were arranged like a tableau of wealth and privilege, with Sarah beaming in the center, finally where she felt she belonged. "Let me tell you a story, William," I said. 3 years ago, when the Pemberton family lost this estate in their divorce proceedings, I saw an opportunity. Not just a business opportunity, mind you, but something more personal. I remembered that day clearly. The auction had been held on a rainy Tuesday morning, and I'd been the only bidder who'd come prepared with financing already arranged. The Pembertons had built this place as their dream home, But when their marriage fell apart, their dream became my investment. Sarah had just gotten engaged to Bradley, I continued. She was already talking about wanting a fairy tale wedding at a venue that would impress his family. I thought about all those years of her being embarrassed by our modest lifestyle, and I decided to buy her the perfect wedding venue. William nodded slowly. You bought this estate for your daughter's wedding? Partly, I admitted. But mostly, I bought it because it was a good investment. The location, the architecture, the grounds, I knew it would generate significant revenue as an event venue. The fact that it would also give Sarah her dream wedding was just a bonus. I pulled out the property deed from my desk drawer, the one that clearly showed Morrison Holdings, LLC, as the legal owner of the Grand Willow estate. Sarah had never asked who owned the venue when she'd booked it. She'd simply assumed it was another example of her fiancé's family's connections and influence. The irony, I said, running my finger along the deed's official seal, is that she specifically chose this venue because she wanted to impress the Whitmores. She wanted them to see her as someone who belonged in their world, someone who could appreciate and access the finest things in life. William was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Mr. Morrison, forgive me for asking, but why haven't you told her? Surely she would be grateful to know that you made her dream wedding possible. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. William, you heard what she said out there. She called me broke. She told a room full of people that I'm an embarrassment, that I don't belong in places like this. Do you think she would be grateful? Or do you think she would be mortified to learn that her broke father actually owns the venue she's using to prove her worth to high society? The truth was more complicated than that, of course. Sarah's relationship with money had always been twisted by her desire to escape what she saw as our family's humble origins. Even if she learned about my wealth, she would probably find a way to be angry about it. Angry that I'd hidden it from her. Angry that I'd let her believe we were struggling. Angry that I'd somehow tricked her into respecting me for the wrong reasons. There's something else you should know, I said, pulling out another document. The Henderson family, that's Sarah's married name now, they've been having some financial difficulties with the final payment for today's event. William nodded. Yes, sir, Mr. Bradley Henderson asked about extending the payment terms just yesterday. Apparently, there were some unexpected family expenses that affected their cash flow. This was news to me, and it added another layer of irony to the situation. Here was Sarah, marrying into a family she believed to be wealthier and more successful than her own, only to discover that they were having trouble paying for the wedding at a venue owned by the father she'd just publicly humiliated. What exactly did Bradley tell you about these financial difficulties? Well, sir, he was quite embarrassed about it. Apparently, his father's latest business venture didn't perform as expected, and they've had to liquidate some investments to cover their losses. The wedding was already paid for in installments, but they're short about $15,000 for the final payment. $15,000. I spent more than that on landscaping for the estate each month. For the Whitmores, it was apparently a significant enough shortfall to cause stress and embarrassment. And what did you tell him? I told him what you instructed me to tell all. Clients in payment difficulties that we would need to discuss any extensions with the property owner directly. I smiled for the first time since arriving at the wedding. Perfect. And I assume you haven't mentioned to anyone that I am the property owner? Of course not, sir. As per your standing instructions, your ownership is kept strictly confidential unless you explicitly authorize disclosure. I stood up and walked to the window, watching Sarah laugh at something Patricia Whitmore was saying. They looked so comfortable together, so perfectly matched in their casual cruelty and entitlement. Sarah had found her tribe, all right. People who measured worth by bank accounts and looked down on anyone who didn't meet their arbitrary standards of success. William, I said, I want you to prepare the final payment invoice for the Henderson-Whitmore wedding, and I want you to make it clear that payment must be settled with the property owner before the reception ends tonight. Yes, sir. And when they asked to speak with the property owner, I turned back to face him, and I could see my own reflection in the window behind him. A man who had spent years hiding his success, years trying to teach his daughter humility and appreciation through modesty. only to have her turn that modesty into a weapon against him. When they asked to speak with the property owner, I said, "You're going to tell them that he's been here the entire time. In fact, you're going to tell them that he's a guest at the wedding." William's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Mr. Morrison, are you sure about this?" I thought about Sarah's words again, about the laughter of the guests, about the years of sacrifice and support that she'd dismissed so casually. I thought about the college fund I'd established, the monthly checks I'd sent, the car I'd bought, the dreams I'd enabled, all while she grew more ashamed of me with each passing year. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. "It's time my daughter learned the truth about the man she just called broke in front of 200 people. I walked back to my desk and picked up the property deed, holding it like the weapon it was about to become. Outside, the string quartet was playing Canon in D again, and guests were beginning to make their way toward the reception hall for dinner. "William," I said, "make sure that invoice is delivered during the dinner service. And make sure it's delivered publicly, in front of the wedding party and their families." "Yes, sir, and sir, for what it's worth, I think your daughter is about to learn a very important lesson about judging people by appearances." I folded the deed carefully and placed it in my jacket pocket. "I hope so, William, because today she's going to discover that sometimes the people you look down on are actually the ones holding you up." The cocktail hour was torture. Pure, refined torture served with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. I stood near the bar, nursing a whiskey that I desperately wanted to be stronger, watching as Sarah worked the room like a politician campaigning for votes. She glided from group to group, her white dress catching the light from the crystal chandeliers, her laugh musical and perfectly timed. To anyone watching, she was the picture of bridal bliss. But I knew better. I could see the way she steered conversations, the way she positioned herself next to the Whitmore family members, the way she subtly excluded me from every photograph, every introduction, every moment that mattered. "Oh, there's my father," I heard her say to a group of Bradley's college friends. Her tone was light, dismissive, the way someone might point out a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the decor. He tries his best." The young men looked over at me with the kind of polite pity that rich people perfect by their teenage years. One of them, a blond boy who looked like he'd never worked a day in his life, raised his glass in my direction with a condescending smile. I raised my whiskey back, wondering what he'd do if he knew that the watch on my wrist cost more than his car. The photographer was the worst part. Every time she tried to include me in a family shot, Sarah would find a reason to object. "Oh, let's just do the immediate family first," she'd say when the photographer suggested a shot with me and the bride and groom. "Actually, could we get one with just the Whitmore side?" she'd suggest when I was finally included in a group photo. "Dad, could you step back just a little? You're casting a shadow on my dress." Each rejection was delivered with a sweet smile and a tone that suggested she was being helpful rather than hurtful. But the message was clear. I didn't belong in her perfect day, her perfect photos, her perfect new life. Patricia Whitmore seemed to take particular pleasure in my exclusion. She appeared beside me during one especially painful moment when Sarah had asked me to step out of yet another family photo. "It must be difficult," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "watching your daughter move up in the world. Sometimes children outgrow their parents, don't they?" I looked at her steadily. "Sometimes parents surprise their children, too." She laughed, a sound like ice clinking in an expensive glass. "Oh, I doubt that. Some people are simply born to certain stations in life. Sarah, bless her heart, seems determined to rise above her circumstances." "And what exactly do you think her circumstances are?" Patricia's smile was razor-sharp. "Well, let's be honest. A working-class father, raised in... what did she say? A janitor's family? It's quite admirable that she's managed to elevate herself to Bradley's level. Love conquers all, I suppose, even differences in breeding." Breeding. The word hit me like a physical slap. Not background, not circumstances. Breeding. As if I were some kind of animal that had somehow wandered into their pedigree show. I was about to respond when Bradley appeared, sliding his arm around his mother's waist with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "Mother, you're not interrogating Sarah's father, are you?" He smiled at me, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "I hope you're enjoying the venue, Mr. I'm sorry, I don't think I caught your last name." "Morrison," I said. "David Morrison. Right, of course. Well, Mr. Morrison, you must be proud that Sarah managed to book the Grand Willow Estate for our wedding. I know it's quite expensive, but she was determined to have the best." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Of course, my family was happy to help make her dreams come true. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered that I almost admired it. Bradley was taking credit for booking the venue, subtly letting me know that the Whitmore money had made this wedding possible, while simultaneously suggesting that Sarah's dreams were beyond my modest means. I watched Sarah approach us, her face glowing with happiness and champagne. She slipped her hand into Bradley's with practiced grace, and for a moment she looked like the little girl I'd raised. Beautiful, radiant, full of joy. Then she opened her mouth. "Bradley, darling, I was just telling the Hendersons about Dad's unique background. They were fascinated by his work stories." She turned to me with that same sweet, poisonous smile. "Dad, tell them about the time you had to clean up after that office Christmas party. The one with the incident." The story she wanted me to tell was from 25 years ago, when I was working nights to pay for business school. A group of drunk executives had trashed a conference room, and I'd spent hours cleaning up vomit and broken glass. Sarah had been 5 years old when I'd told her that story, explaining why Daddy came home so tired and smelled like cleaning supplies. Now she wanted me to tell it as entertainment for her new family, as evidence of how far she'd come from her humble origins. I looked at my daughter, at her husband, at his mother with her diamond earrings and superior smile. I thought about the deed folded in my jacket pocket, about William preparing the final payment invoice, about the conversation that was coming. "You know what, Sarah?" I said, finishing my whiskey in one swallow. "I think I'll save that story for later. Something tells me the evening is going to be full of surprises." Part 5. Remembering the Sacrifices, 900 words. As I walked away from Sarah and the Whitmores, their laughter following me like a pack of hunting dogs, I found myself in the estate's library, a quiet sanctuary lined with leather-bound books and warmed by a crackling fireplace. I needed a moment to breathe, to remember why I was here, to remember who I really was beneath the shame my daughter had draped over me like a burial shroud. I sank into one of the wingback chairs and closed my eyes, letting the memories wash over me. Sarah was 3 years old when Ellen died. 3 years old and asking why Mommy wouldn't wake up, why Daddy was crying, why everyone was dressed in black. I remembered holding her tiny hand at the funeral, feeling like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet, knowing that from that moment forward, everything would be different. The life insurance money was enough to cover Ellen's medical bills and the funeral, with a small amount left over that I put away for Sarah's future. But it wasn't enough to maintain our previous lifestyle. Ellen had been a nurse, and her income had allowed us to live comfortably. Not luxuriously, but comfortably. Without her, I had to make some hard choices. The night job at Morrison Office Complex was one of those choices. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. I was cleaning the offices of the very building that would eventually house my first real estate investment. But at the time, it was just survival. 8 hours a day at my regular job in property maintenance, then 5 hours at night mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Sarah would be asleep when I left for the night shift, and sometimes she'd still be sleeping when I got home at 6 in the morning. Mrs. Patterson next door watched her during those hours, and Sarah never seemed to understand why Daddy was always so tired, why there were never any vacations, why other kids had things that she couldn't have. I remembered the Christmas when she was 7. She'd wanted a particular doll, some expensive thing that all her classmates had. I'd worked extra shifts for 2 months to afford it, picking up weekend cleaning jobs at other office buildings, coming home with my hands cracked and bleeding from the harsh cleaning chemicals. On Christmas morning, she'd opened the box and her face had lit up with pure joy. "Daddy, you got her. You got the doll I wanted. That look, that moment of absolute happiness had made every extra hour worth it. But when she took the doll to school after the holiday break, one of her friends had pointed out that it wasn't the newest model, that the hair was slightly different from the current version. Sarah had come home disappointed, asking why I couldn't have gotten the right one. As she got older, the requests became more expensive and the disappointments more frequent. The bike I bought her wasn't the right brand. The clothes I could afford weren't from the stores where her friends shopped. The house we lived in wasn't in the good neighborhood, but I kept working, kept sacrificing, kept building something bigger for both of us. The real estate business started by accident. One of the office buildings I cleaned was being sold, and I overheard the owner complaining about how little he was going to make after fees and taxes. I'd been studying business and finance during every spare moment I had, reading books at the library while Sarah did her homework, taking night classes when I could afford them. I made him an offer, not for the building, which was beyond my reach, but for a small strip mall he also owned. I'd saved every penny I could for 5 years, living on ramen noodles and generic groceries, driving a car that barely ran, wearing clothes until they fell apart. The down payment took everything I had. Everything. Sarah was 12 when I bought that first property, and I tried to explain to her what it meant. This is going to change things for us, sweetheart. This is going to be the foundation of something bigger. But she didn't see opportunity. She saw another example of her father's weird obsessions, another reason why we couldn't have nice things like other families. Why did you buy some stupid old building instead of getting us a better house? She'd asked. I tried to explain about investment, about building equity, about creating a future. But to a 12-year-old girl who just wanted to fit in with her peers, it sounded like excuses. The strip mall did well. Within 2 years, I was able to buy another property, then another. I started Morrison Holdings when Sarah was 15, keeping the name simple and the operation modest. I didn't want attention, didn't want people to know how well I was doing. I'd grown up watching what wealth did to people, how it changed them, corrupted them, made them forget where they came from. I wanted Sarah to learn the value of hard work, to appreciate what she had, to understand that success came from effort and sacrifice, not from privilege and entitlement. I wanted her to be proud of me for building something from nothing, not ashamed of me for where I'd started. By the time she graduated high school, Morrison Holdings owned 12 properties and was generating more income than I'd ever dreamed possible. I could have moved us to a mansion, could have bought her any car she wanted, could have revealed the truth about our financial situation. Instead, I kept living modestly, kept the business quiet, kept hoping that Sarah would eventually see value in the man I was rather than disappointment in the things I couldn't buy her. The college fund I'd established could have paid for Harvard, Yale, anywhere she wanted to go, but she chose Northwestern, and I let her believe the scholarship she'd received was based purely on merit. I wanted her to feel accomplished, to believe in her own abilities. Even after she graduated and started working, I continued supporting her quietly. The monthly checks I sent weren't charity. They were investments in my daughter's happiness, attempts to bridge the gap between what she needed and what she could afford. But somewhere along the way, my sacrifice had become her expectation. My support had become her entitlement. My love had become her ammunition. Now, sitting in this library in the estate I'd bought partly for her benefit, listening to the sound of her wedding reception beginning in the next room, I realized that all my good intentions had backfired spectacularly. I'd raised a daughter who was ashamed of me, who saw my success as inadequate and my love as insufficient. It was time for that to change. I stood up, straightened my tie, and checked my watch. In exactly 30 minutes, William would deliver the final payment invoice to the head table. In 30 minutes, my daughter would begin to understand the true cost of her casual cruelty. I walked toward the reception hall, ready to reclaim my dignity and teach Sarah a lesson about judging people by their balance sheets rather than their character. The reckoning was about to begin. The reception hall was magnificent. I had to admit, Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory silk, and the floral arrangements, roses, peonies, and baby's breath, filled the air with their delicate fragrance. A string quartet played softly in the corner while guests found their seats, champagne glasses already filled and waiting at each place setting. I found my assigned table near the back of the room, naturally. Table 12, with a collection of distant relatives and family friends who didn't quite fit into the main social circles. The placement wasn't accidental. It was a final insult, a physical representation of my status in Sarah's new world. As I sat down, I noticed William Chen moving discreetly between the tables, checking with the catering staff and ensuring everything was running smoothly. He caught my eye for just a moment and gave an almost imperceptible nod. The invoice was ready. The moment of truth was approaching. At the head table, Sarah was radiant in the soft lighting, her hand resting on Bradley's arm as they accepted congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. Patricia Whitmore sat beside them, holding court like a queen at her royal banquet, her diamond necklace catching the light with every gesture. "Excuse me, are you Sarah's father?" I turned to find a woman in her 60s settling into the chair beside me. She had kind eyes and a warm smile that seemed genuine, a refreshing change from the calculating expressions I'd been encountering all day. "Yes, I'm David Morrison," I said, extending my hand. "Margaret Henley," she replied, shaking my hand firmly. "I'm Bradley's great-aunt. I've been looking forward to meeting you all day." "Have you?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "That's refreshing." Margaret laughed, a sound that reminded me of Ellen's laugh, warm and unguarded. "Oh, don't mind Patricia and her crowd. They can be a bit particular about social hierarchies. But I've raised 4 children of my own, and I know that good parents come from all walks of life." I felt something loosen in my chest at her words. "Thank you. That means more than you know." "Sarah spoke very highly of you when Bradley brought her to our family reunion last summer," Margaret continued. "She told us about how you raised her on your own after her mother passed, how hard you worked to give her opportunities. She seemed very proud of you then." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sarah had been proud of me, had spoken well of me to Bradley's family? Then what had changed? What had happened between last summer and today? She said that? Oh yes. She talked about your work ethic, how you always put her needs first, how you taught her to be independent and strong. Honestly, I was quite impressed. Single parenthood is never easy, especially for fathers. I stared across the room at Sarah, trying to reconcile Margaret's words with the woman who had humiliated me just hours earlier. Had something shifted in her perspective? Had the wedding pressure, the desire to impress the Whitmores, transformed her genuine feelings into something ugly and performative? "Margaret," I said carefully, "did Sarah seem different to you today? During the ceremony, perhaps?" Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, yes. She seemed quite tense, actually. Almost like she was performing rather than celebrating. And that business earlier, in the foyer..." She shook her head sadly. "That wasn't the young woman I met last summer. That was someone trying very hard to be someone else." Before I could respond, the sound of silverware against crystal filled the room. Bradley was standing at the head table, champagne glass raised, ready to make his welcome speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily through the elegant space. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this incredible day with Sarah and me." The room fell silent. All attention focused on the handsome young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine advertisement for expensive watches. "When I met Sarah 2 years ago," Bradley continued, "I was struck not just by her beauty, but by her strength, her determination, how should I put this? Her ability to transcend her circumstances and become the remarkable woman she is today." I felt my jaw clench. Transcend her circumstances. As if the life I'd provided for her, the love I'd given her, the values I'd tried to instill were obstacles she'd had to overcome. "Sarah represents the very best of the American dream," Bradley went on. "The idea that with enough determination and grace, anyone can rise to achieve greatness. She's transformed herself from He paused, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. She's transformed herself into someone who belongs in any room, at any table, in any society. She's proven that breeding isn't everything, that character and ambition can triumph over background. The applause was polite but uncomfortable. I could see some guests shifting in their seats, sensing the underlying cruelty in Bradley's seemingly complimentary words. He was praising Sarah by diminishing me, celebrating her ascension by highlighting what he saw as my inadequacy. Sarah beamed at her new husband, either oblivious to the insults embedded in his speech or fully complicit in them. She raised her own glass and stood beside him. "Thank you, darling," she said, her voice clear and confident. "You're absolutely right. I've learned that sometimes you have to leave certain things behind to move forward. Sometimes love means making difficult choices about who belongs in your future." Her eyes found mine across the room for just a moment, and I saw no warmth there, no filial affection, no acknowledgement of the man who had raised her. I saw only cold calculation, the look of someone cutting away dead weight. Margaret placed her hand gently on my arm. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "This isn't right." I patted her hand gratefully, then reached into my jacket pocket and felt the folded deed. In 10 minutes, William would approach the head table with the final payment invoice. In 10 minutes, Sarah would learn that sometimes the people you're trying to leave behind are actually the ones who made your dreams possible. "Margaret," I said quietly, "I think you're about to see a very different version of your great-nephew's wife." She looked at me with confusion and concern. "What do you mean?" I checked my watch. 8 minutes now. Let's just say that Sarah is about to discover that some circumstances can't be transcended, only acknowledged. At the head table, Bradley was launching into another toast, this one about the importance of choosing partners who shared your values and aspirations. Patricia Whitmore was nodding approvingly, her face glowing with satisfaction at having successfully absorbed Sarah into their social circle. They had no idea that in less than 10 minutes, their entire understanding of the evening, the venue, and the humble father they'd been patronizing all day would be turned completely upside down. I took a sip of my champagne and settled back to watch the show. 25 years of sacrifice, humiliation, and unacknowledged love were about to come due. With interest, the main course had just been served. Filet mignon with truffle sauce, Sarah's favorite, when I saw William Chen approaching the head table with a leather portfolio in his hands. He moved with the discretion of a professional, but I could see the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful way he navigated between the tables. This was it. The conversation at my table had turned to mundane wedding topics: the beauty of the flowers, the elegance of the venue, the loveliness of the ceremony. Margaret Henley was describing her own wedding 40 years earlier when William reached the head table and leaned down to whisper something in Bradley's ear. I watched Bradley's face change, confusion replacing his earlier smugness. He said something back to William, his voice too low for me to hear but his body language clearly indicating surprise. Sarah looked up from her conversation with Patricia, noticing her husband's sudden shift in demeanor. William straightened and spoke again, this time loud enough that I caught fragments. "Final payment. Property owner. Needs to be resolved tonight." The color drained from Bradley's face. He glanced around the room as if looking for an escape route, then leaned over to whisper something urgent to his father, who was seated 2 chairs away. Robert Whitmore's reaction was immediate and visceral. His fork clattered against his plate, and his face flushed deep red. Sarah was asking questions now, her voice carrying an edge of panic that cut through the ambient noise of the reception. "What's wrong? What's he talking about? Bradley, what final payment?" Patricia leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the light as she demanded answers from her son and husband. The entire head table was beginning to buzz with worried conversation, and guests at nearby tables were starting to notice the disturbance. William maintained his professional composure, but I could see him gesture toward the back office, suggesting they move the conversation somewhere more private. But Robert Whitmore was having none of it. His voice rose to a level that carried across the reception hall. "What do you mean, the owner? We were told this was handled through a management company. Sir, William replied, his voice calm but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over nearby tables. The final payment terms require direct approval from the property owner. It's stated clearly in the contract your family signed. But who is the owner? Sarah's voice was shrill now, cutting through the elegant atmosphere like a knife through silk. Just tell us who we need to speak with. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I stood up from my table, the movement deliberate and unhurried. Margaret looked up at me with concern, but I gave her a reassuring smile. "Excuse me," I said, loud enough for the head table to hear. "I believe you're looking for me." Every head in the immediate vicinity turned toward me. Sarah's eyes widened in confusion, then narrowed in what looked like embarrassment. Bradley looked from me to William and back again, as if trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "I'm sorry," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension even in her confusion. "But we're trying to resolve a business matter with the property owner. Perhaps you could—" "I am the property owner," I said, walking slowly toward the head table. My voice carried clearly through the reception hall, and I could feel the attention of the entire room focusing on our exchange. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at me as if I'd just announced I was actually an alien from another planet. Bradley's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. Robert Whitmore looked like he was having some sort of medical emergency. Patricia was the first to recover her voice. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the property deed, unfolding it with deliberate care. I said I'm the property owner. Morrison Holdings, LLC, is the legal owner of the Grand Willow Estate. I'm David Morrison, CEO and principal shareholder of Morrison Holdings. I handed the deed to William, who passed it to Bradley with professional efficiency. Bradley stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process what he was reading. This can't be right," Sarah whispered, but her voice carried in the stunned silence of the reception hall. "Dad, this is some kind of mistake. I don't what, Sarah?" I asked, my voice gentle but firm. "I don't own property? I don't have money? I don't belong in places like this?" The guests were fully engaged now, turning in their chairs to watch the drama unfolding at the head table. I could see phones being discreetly pulled out, guests preparing to document whatever was about to happen next. Robert Whitmore had recovered enough to snatch the deed from his son's hands, his eyes scanning the document with the desperate intensity of someone looking for an escape clause. This Morrison Holdings. We were told this was managed by Chen Hospitality Group. William's company manages the property for me, I explained calmly. It's a business arrangement that's proven quite profitable for both of us. William handles the day-to-day operations while I handle the strategic decisions and major contracts. "Major contracts," Bradley repeated weakly. Like our wedding contract?" "Exactly like your wedding contract." I pulled out my phone and opened the contract management app that gave me access to all the documents related to the venue's bookings. "In fact, let me check on the status of your final payment." My fingers moved across the screen with deliberate slowness, giving everyone time to process what was happening. Sarah was staring at me with the expression I'd never seen before. Not embarrassment. Not anger, but something that looked almost like terror. "According to my records," I said, reading from the screen, "the Henderson-Whitmore wedding contract shows a balance of $15,437.62. The contract specifies that this final payment must be settled before the conclusion of the reception." "$15,000, Patricia whispered, and I could see her doing rapid calculations in her head, trying to figure out how her wealthy family had ended up short on what should have been a manageable expense. "The good news," I continued, sliding my phone back into my pocket, "is that as the property owner, I have complete discretion over payment terms and contract modifications." I looked directly at Sarah, who was gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles had turned white. "The question is," I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the now silent reception hall, "what do we do about a bride who spent the day telling everyone that her father is broke and doesn't belong in places like this?" The silence stretched on, heavy with anticipation and mortification. 200 guests waited to see what would happen next, their elegant dinner forgotten in favor of the real-life drama playing out before them. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time in her adult life, my daughter was completely, utterly speechless. And I was just getting started. Dear date, the revelation, 200 words. The silence in the Grand Willow Estate reception hall was so complete, I could hear the soft, classical music still playing from the string quartet in the corner. Though the musicians had stopped playing and were staring at our table like everyone else in the room, Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Dad, I don't understand. How is this possible? I looked at my daughter, my beautiful, brilliant, cruel daughter, and felt a mixture of love and disappointment so profound it nearly took my breath away. She sat there in her white dress, surrounded by all the trappings of wealth and status she'd always craved, finally learning that she'd had access to them all along through the father she'd spent years being ashamed of. How is it possible? I repeated, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. Sarah, it's possible because while you were growing up embarrassed by your father's night jobs and modest lifestyle, your father was building a real estate empire. I gestured around the elegant reception hall, at the crystal chandeliers and silk-draped tables, at the French doors leading to the manicured gardens where she'd taken her wedding photos. This estate, I bought it 3 years ago at a bankruptcy auction. The Pemberton family lost it in their divorce proceedings, and I saw an opportunity. Not just a business opportunity, but a personal one. I thought someday my daughter might want to have her wedding somewhere special, somewhere that would make her dreams come true. Bradley was staring at the property deed as if it might spontaneously combust. But Sarah said you were a janitor. She said I was broke, I finished for him. She said I was an embarrassment. She said I didn't belong in places like this. I looked directly at Sarah. Didn't you, sweetheart? Sarah's face cycled through a dozen different emotions. Confusion, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been calculation. I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how to spin this revelation to her advantage. Dad, she said, her voice stronger now, if this is true, then why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think why did you hide this from me? It was a fair question, and one I'd been expecting. I pulled out my phone again and opened the banking app that showed the real-time status of my various accounts and investments. Morrison Holdings currently owns 43 properties across 3 states, I said, reading from the screen. Our annual gross revenue last year was $12.7 million. Our net worth, including liquid assets and property valuations, is approximately $38 million. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the reception hall. Patricia Whitmore looked like she might faint. Robert Whitmore was staring at me with an expression of absolute shock. Bradley appeared to be having some kind of existential crisis. But Sarah looked angry. $38 million? She hissed, leaning forward in her chair. You're worth $38 million and you let me live like we were poor? You let me be embarrassed of you? You let me think I had to marry up to have a decent life? The accusation in her voice cut deep, but I'd been preparing for this moment for hours, days, maybe even years. Sarah, I said calmly, I raised you to value people for their character, not their bank accounts. I wanted you to learn that success comes from hard work and integrity, not from inherited wealth or social connections. I wanted you to be proud of me for who I was, not impressed by me for what I owned. But I could have had everything, she snapped, and there it was. The real Sarah, the one who measured love in dollar signs and success in status symbols. I could have gone to better schools, lived in a better house, had better clothes, better friends. You did go to a better school, I interrupted. Northwestern University. Full scholarship, remember? Except it wasn't a merit scholarship, Sarah. It was the Morrison Academic Excellence Scholarship, which I established and funded specifically for you. Her face went white. You... what? The scholarship that paid for your entire education? That was me. The anonymous donor who covered your tuition, room and board, books, and even your sorority fees? That was me. Every semester for 4 years, I wrote checks to Northwestern to ensure my daughter could get the best education possible." Bradley found his voice again, though it came out strangled. "The Morrison Scholarship? That's worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's one of the most prestigious awards the university offers." "Full ride to Northwestern," I agreed, "including graduate school if she'd chosen to pursue it." I wanted Sarah to feel accomplished, to believe in her own abilities. I wanted her to understand that she'd earned her place in the world through merit, not through family money. Margaret Henley, still seated at my original table, spoke up for the first time since the revelation began. "Sarah, dear, your father gave you the greatest gift any parent can give, the confidence that comes from believing you've succeeded on your own merits." But Sarah wasn't interested in wisdom or gratitude. She was interested in what she saw as years of lost opportunities. "Do you have any idea what my life could have been like?" she demanded, standing up from her chair, her white dress flowing around her like a flag of surrender. "Do you know how many times I felt inferior to my friends? How many times I was embarrassed because we lived in that tiny house and drove that old car?" "That tiny house was a 4-bedroom colonial in one of the best school districts in the state," I replied. "That old car was a reliable vehicle that got you safely to school every day for 6 years. And every single thing you had, every opportunity you received, came from a father who loved you enough to work 18-hour days to provide for you." The room was completely silent now, every guest hanging on our every word. This was better than any reality TV show, more dramatic than any soap opera. This was real life playing out in all its messy, complicated glory. Patricia Whitmore finally found her voice. "Mr. Morrison," she said, and her tone was completely different now, respectful, even deferential. "I believe we may have misunderstood your situation." I looked at her steadily. "You didn't misunderstand anything, Mrs. Whitmore. You judged me based on my daughter's description of me, and her description was designed to make you think I was beneath your family's social status. The only thing you misunderstood was believing that social status has anything to do with actual worth." I turned back to Sarah, who was standing frozen beside her chair, tears beginning to stream down her carefully made-up face. "The question now, sweetheart, is what happens next. Because in about 10 minutes, William is going to need that final payment for your dream wedding at the venue your broke father owns. And I'm curious to know whether the daughter who just spent the day humiliating me in front of 200 people thinks she deserves my help." The silence stretched on, and I could see Sarah's mind racing, trying to figure out how to navigate this impossible situation. She'd built her entire wedding day around the narrative of escaping her humble origins, only to discover that her origins weren't humble at all. She'd just been too ashamed to see their true value. "Dad," she whispered finally, her voice breaking, I don't know what to say." "How about starting with the truth?" I suggested gently. "How about starting with why you felt the need to humiliate the man who made all of this possible?" Part 9. The Daughter's Collapse, 1,000 Words. Sarah stood there in her designer wedding dress, tears streaming down her face, and for a moment she looked like the little girl I remembered, vulnerable, confused, and desperately in need of her father's guidance. But then I saw her expression harden, saw her draw herself up with that familiar stubborn pride that had defined so much of our relationship. "You want the truth," she said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to fall. "The truth is that you lied to me. You lied to me for years. You let me believe we were struggling, let me feel inferior, let me think I had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to get half as much." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire, and I could see the wedding guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked sympathetic to Sarah's position. Others seemed appalled by her response to the revelation. Patricia Whitmore reached out tentatively to touch Sarah's arm. "Darling, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," Sarah snapped, shaking off her new mother-in-law's hand. "I want everyone to hear this. I want everyone to understand what it's like to discover that your entire life has been built on a lie." She turned to face the room full of guests, her voice rising with each word. "Do you know what it's like to grow up ashamed of your father? To make excuses for why you can't bring friends home? Why your house isn't as nice as theirs? Why your clothes come from discount stores instead of boutiques. Margaret Henley spoke up from my original table, her voice gentle but firm. Sarah, dear, shame is a choice. Your father gave you love, security, and opportunity. Many children would be grateful for such gifts. Grateful? Sarah laughed, but it was a harsh sound with no humor in it. Grateful to be deceived? To be treated like I couldn't handle the truth about my own family situation. Bradley finally stood up, moving to his wife's side with obvious concern. Sarah, honey, maybe we should calm down and— Don't you dare tell me to calm down, she whirled on him, her eyes blazing. Your family has been looking down on my father all day. Your mother treated him like he was some kind of charity case. And now we find out that he's probably wealthier than all of you combined. The words hit Bradley and his family like a physical blow. Robert Whitmore's face flushed deep red, and Patricia looked like she'd been caught shoplifting at a charity gala. Sarah, I said quietly, this isn't about them. This is about us, about the choices we both made, and the consequences of those choices. She spun back toward me, her wedding dress swirling around her ankles. The consequences. The consequences are that I married into a family thinking I was lucky to be accepted by them, when the truth is they should have been honored to have me. The mercenary nature of that statement, the idea that her worth was measured by her family's net worth rather than her own character, sent a chill through the reception hall. I could see guests exchanging glances, and not the kind that suggested they were impressed by Sarah's revelation. Is that really how you see marriage? I asked. As a transaction based on relative wealth. That's how the world works, Dad, she shot back. You can pretend it doesn't. You can live in your modest little house and drive your practical little car and pretend that money doesn't matter, but it does matter. It matters to everyone in this room. She gestured wildly at the assembled wedding guests. These people don't care about character or integrity or any of that noble nonsense you tried to teach me. They care about success, about status, about being associated with winners instead of losers. The words echoed in the suddenly quiet reception hall, and I could see the impact they had on the assembled guests. Sarah had just insulted every single person in the room, suggesting that they were all shallow social climbers who only valued wealth and status. Margaret Henley stood up slowly, her voice carrying clearly through the silence. Young lady, I think you may be projecting your own values onto others. Not everyone measures worth in dollars and cents. Several other guests murmured agreement, and I could see Sarah beginning to realize that her emotional outburst was backfiring spectacularly. She was alienating the very people she'd been trying to impress all day. Patricia Whitmore looked absolutely mortified. Sarah, dear, I think perhaps the stress of the wedding day has— Stop making excuses for me. Sarah screamed, and several guests actually flinched at the volume. I'm not stressed, I'm angry. I'm angry that I've wasted years of my life being ashamed of a father who could have given me everything I ever wanted. And what exactly did you want? I asked, my voice still calm despite the chaos swirling around us. What would have been different if you'd known about the money? Sarah's answer came without hesitation. Everything. I would have gone to a better high school, joined the right clubs, met the right people. I would have applied to Ivy League schools instead of settling for Northwestern. I would have had the right clothes, the right car, the right friends who could have opened doors for me. The naked ambition in her voice, the complete absence of any consideration for values beyond social advancement, was breathtaking in its honesty. This was my daughter stripped of all pretense, revealing the person she'd actually become beneath all the love and values I'd tried to instill in her. Sarah, Bradley said quietly, his voice filled with a disappointment that cut through her anger like ice water. Do you hear yourself? Do you hear what you're saying? She turned to look at her new husband, and for the first time since the revelation began, I saw uncertainty in her eyes. Bradley was looking at her like he'd never seen her before, like she was a stranger wearing his wife's wedding dress. I'm saying that I deserved better than I got, she said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. I'm saying that I had a right to know the truth about my own family. You had the truth, I said sadly. You just didn't recognize it. The truth was that you had a father who loved you unconditionally, who worked tirelessly to provide for you, who sacrificed his own comfort to ensure your happiness and success. The truth was that you were raised with love, values, and opportunity. I paused, looking around the room at the shocked faces of the wedding guests. The truth was that you were never poor, Sarah. You were rich in all the ways that actually matter. You just chose to feel poor because you were measuring your worth against the wrong standard. Sarah stared at me for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths, tears still streaming down her face. Then she did something that broke my heart all over again. She turned and ran. Sarah's wedding dress disappeared through the French doors leading to the garden, leaving behind a reception hall full of stunned guests and a family in crisis. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft sound of Patricia Whitmore crying quietly into her napkin. Bradley stood frozen beside his empty chair, staring at the doors where his bride had vanished. His face cycled through confusion, embarrassment, and what looked like dawning realization about the woman he'd just married. Should someone go after her? He asked, his voice uncertain. I looked at my new son-in-law. This young man who had spent the day subtly insulting me while taking credit for providing Sarah with the wedding of her dreams. He looked lost, like a child who discovered that his favorite toy was broken and couldn't be fixed. Bradley, I said gently, that's a decision you'll have to make for yourself. But before you do, I think you should understand something about the woman you married. He looked at me with desperate hope, as if I might have some wisdom that could make sense of the chaos his wedding day had become. Sarah has spent her entire adult life running away from what she saw as the limitations of her background, I continued. She built her identity around the idea that she was rising above her circumstances, transcending her humble origins, learning that those origins were never humble at all. It's shattered the story she's been telling herself about who she is. Margaret Henley approached us, her face full of compassion and concern. David, dear, you handled that with more grace than I would have managed. But what happens now? It was a good question. What did happen now? I owned the venue, my daughter had just humiliated herself in front of 200 people, and there was still a wedding reception to finish and a bill to pay. William Chen appeared at my elbow, ever the professional. Mr. Morrison, what would you like me to do about the evening service? The staff is waiting for direction. I looked around the reception hall at the assembled guests. Some were whispering among themselves, others were checking their phones, and a few were beginning to gather their belongings as if preparing to leave. This was supposed to be a celebration, but it had turned into a spectacle. William, I said, please ask the kitchen to prepare the wedding cake for serving. Ask the band to resume playing. And please inform the staff that all bar service for the remainder of the evening is complimentary, courtesy of the management. Sir? William looked confused. You want to continue the reception? These people came here to celebrate a wedding, I replied. They got dressed up, brought gifts, and planned to spend their evening at a party. The fact that the bride is having an emotional crisis doesn't mean we should ruin everyone else's night. I walked to the center of the reception hall and raised my voice slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. The conversations died down, and all eyes turned toward me. I could see curiosity, sympathy, and no small amount of morbid fascination in their faces. I know this evening has taken some unexpected turns, I began, and I apologize for the disruption to what should have been a joyful celebration. However, I hope you'll allow me to salvage something positive from this situation. I gestured toward the beautiful room around us. You're in one of the most elegant venues in the state, surrounded by wonderful food, excellent music, and good company. My daughter may have forgotten the purpose of this gathering, but I haven't. This is supposed to be about love, family, and the joy of bringing people together. I looked directly at Bradley, who was still standing beside the head table looking shell-shocked. Bradley, you're a good young man who deserves better than what happened here tonight. Whatever you decide about your marriage, you shouldn't have to face it alone. Then I addressed the room again. So I'm asking you to stay, to enjoy the rest of the evening, to dance and laugh and remember that sometimes the most important thing we can do is show up for each other, even when things get complicated." Margaret Henley started clapping and others gradually joined in. Not enthusiastic applause, but the kind of supportive acknowledgement that people give when someone has handled a difficult situation with dignity. Patricia Whitmore approached me tentatively, her earlier arrogance completely gone. "Mr. Morrison, I owe you an apology. I judged you unfairly today, and I'm ashamed of my behavior." "Thank you," I said simply. "But the only judgment that really matters is the one we make about ourselves." Over the next hour, something remarkable happened. The reception gradually transformed from a scene of family drama into something more genuine than most wedding parties ever achieve. Guests who had been strangers began talking to each other, sharing their own stories about family complications and misunderstandings. The music played, people danced, and the wedding cake was served with toasts that focused on love, forgiveness, and the complexity of human relationships. Bradley spent most of the evening sitting quietly at the head table, occasionally accepting condolences or advice from family members and friends. I saw him slip out to the garden once, presumably to look for Sarah, but he returned alone 15 minutes later. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to shake my hand or offer words of support. Some shared their own stories about difficult family relationships, about children who had disappointed them or parents they'd taken for granted. Margaret Henley was one of the last to leave. She hugged me warmly and pressed a business card into my hand. "David," she said, "I hope you know that what happened tonight wasn't really about the money. It was about a young woman who lost sight of what really matters. Give her time. Sometimes people need to lose everything they think they want before they can appreciate what they actually have." After the last guest had gone and the staff had finished cleaning up, I found myself alone in the reception hall where my daughter's wedding had imploded. William approached with the final paperwork for the evening. "Mr. Morrison," he said, "what should I do about the outstanding balance on the Henderson account?" $15,400. "Mark it as paid in full," I said without hesitation. William looked surprised. "Sir?" I looked around the empty reception hall at the remnants of what should have been one of the happiest days of my daughter's life. "Consider it a wedding gift," I said, "even if the recipient doesn't appreciate it yet." As I drove home that night, I thought about Sarah, probably still in her wedding dress, trying to figure out how to reconcile the father she'd been ashamed of with the successful businessman she'd just discovered him to be. I thought about Bradley, spending his wedding night alone in a luxury hotel, wondering if he'd married the woman he thought he knew. Most of all, I thought about the choices we make about how to measure our worth and the worth of others. Sarah had spent years measuring herself against the wrong standard, and it had cost her the ability to appreciate the love and support that had been there all along. I couldn't force her to change her perspective, couldn't make her understand that she'd always been rich in the ways that mattered most, but I could hope that someday, when the shock and anger faded, she might remember that the father she'd been so ashamed of was the same man who had quietly, consistently, and unconditionally loved her through every stage of her life. The Grand Willow Estate disappeared in my rearview mirror, its elegant silhouette outlined against the night sky. Tomorrow it would host another celebration, another family's dreams and hopes. Tonight, it had taught my daughter a lesson about the danger of judging people by their bank accounts rather than their character. Whether she learned from that lesson remained to be seen. But for the first time in years, I drove home with my dignity intact, my secret revealed, and my head held high. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything.